There's one type of narcissism that's on the rise, and you've probably never heard of it. Since narcissism has become more of a mainstream topic online, people may believe there are more narcissists than ever. In an interview for the Love and Empowerment Summit, Dr. Ramani, a clinical psychologist, retired professor of psychology, New York Times best-selling author, and a noteworthy expert on narcissism, insists that's not true, except with one specific type of narcissism diagnosis: vulnerable narcissism.
I don't think that the rise in narcissism has contributed to the dissolution of marriage. I think people who are going through the dissolution of marriage are more often now citing the patterns that are consistent with narcissism as being the issue. Does that make sense? So it's a willingness to say, this stuff isn't okay. And I think for many generations, the bad behavior, the narcissistic behavior that was happening in a relationship was often just sort of put in the drawer of marriage is hard.
There doesn't seem to be a lot of truth in the idea that narcissism is on the rise, and Dr. Keith Campbell, a narcissism researcher at the University of Georgia, agrees with Dr. Ramani that there's not been an increase in malignant or grandiose narcissism, but there has been one among vulnerable narcissists, as shown in the Journal of Personality. Before we talk about vulnerable narcissism, however, we should start by explaining some baseline traits of narcissism.
A narcissistic person is a person who has relatively low empathy and definitely inconsistent empathy. They're grandiose, they're arrogant, they need lots of validation, lots of attention, and they often go and seek it out. They're deeply entitled, they're very selfish, very superficial, appearance-focused, all of that stuff, very vain. They envy other people. There's a lot of hostility. They're very controlling. They need to dominate. They need to be the ones in power. Those are the broad strokes of narcissism.
The first trait is selective kindness. People who seem nice but are actually narcissistic often practice selective kindness, which means they're only nice to those who can offer them something in return or boost their social status. Next is their obsession with success. Someone who seems nice but is actually narcissistic might show their true colors when it comes to their drive for success. While reaching for success isn't always an indication of narcissism, the intensity of someone's focus on monetary success or notoriety can signal that someone has narcissistic tendencies. They have an inability to be vulnerable. People who seem nice but are actually narcissistic might come off well initially, but their inherent lack of empathy usually shows itself, which can create major barriers in maintaining close relationships. They are competitive. Having an edge of competitiveness is another trait of people who seem nice but are actually narcissistic. They're usually skilled at hiding just how competitive they are, but they'll take subtle digs at people in casual conversation as a way to assert their dominance. Resentfulness is a trait of people that seem nice but are actually narcissistic. While they might congratulate their coworker for scoring a new client, deep down they're seething, wondering, why them and not me? They frequently love bomb. Another tried and true tactic of narcissists is the practice of love bombing. They'll initially shower you with praise, attention, and affection, making you feel like you're the most important person to them. The opposite side of love bombing is employing the silent treatment, which can be seen as a form of emotional abuse, where they'll withdraw their affection and cut off communication with you. Lastly, narcissists are easily offended. People who seem nice but are actually narcissistic tend to be hypersensitive and easily offended. They see even gentle critique as an attack from people who they believe are just jealous. People who seem nice but are actually narcissistic tend to be hypersensitive and easily offended. They see even gentle critique as an attack from people who they believe are just jealous of their success and stature. Now we can move on to how Dr. Ramani explains vulnerable narcissism and the traits associated with that. Vulnerable narcissists exhibit a petulance or irritability that makes people walk on eggshells, a sullenness or resentfulness that is unwilling to be pleasant, victimhood or victim mentality that begs for sympathy, passive aggression used to manipulate emotions, failure to launch, or an inability to accept self-determination. As described in the British Journal of General Practice, containing a sense of, why does everyone else receive and I don't? And commonly being grieved and angry, which make being around them socially awkward. There are some key differences between vulnerable narcissism and the more well-known malignant narcissism, which is low empathy or an inability to put yourself in the position of others. Selfishness that pervades almost every action, an overwhelming sense of entitlement, and perceiving a grandiosity in all things, whether being observed or not. There are challenges of loving someone with vulnerable narcissism, as Dr. Ramani explains.
So people don't spy it. They're not the shiny, grandiose narcissism who bounds in, looking great and holding court. These are people who are actually not always socially successful, but they think they deserve to be. They think they deserve more success. They don't understand why somebody else had it so easy. And I have to say that in a marriage is wretched. It's absolutely wretched.
I know some of those people, and now I'm like, oh my God,
there's a name.
I'm like, you're a little empathetic, and
you're exactly.
And then, but then you're like, but come on, like you like, come on. So, so interesting.
You're little, and that's why it's so problematic, because you feel pity. Like, these are people who can't seem to think their way out of a paper bag, but they're so grumpy, and it's the silent treatment. And it's like, well, I don't want to go to the party, so you shouldn't go to the party. So people in these relationships see their worlds getting smaller and smaller and smaller all the time. And you're with this person who is never satisfied, never happy.
You feel pity for them, but they're never satisfied or happy. You can completely lose yourself trying to satisfy the vulnerable narcissist. It sounds terrible for those who encounter or live with a vulnerable narcissist. The situation is far worse for the one who suffers from this condition, as explained in the Journal of Psychotherapy Integration. They can find it nearly impossible to find happiness, success, or even contentment, and the road out of suffering is challenging and long if they choose to seek help.